Gurudeva Maheshwara Guru Sakshat Param Brahma Tasmai Shri Guruve Namah Brahmanandam Paramasvikaram Kevalam Jnanamurtim Atmachitam Gagana Sadrisham Tattvamasya Laksham Ekam Nityam Nimanachaklam Sarvade Sachitam Bhavatitam Trigunarahitam Sarvutam Namami. Good evening, great souls. It is an absolute joy and privilege to be here with you this evening and introduce Sam Podany. I should say, our community has had the great pleasure of expanding with Sam through the pandemic. One of our friends, Lisa Murphy, who's not able to be with the satsang tonight, but this is being recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. But Lisa, I believe, read Sam's book and somehow connected with Sam, and one thing led to another, and Sam has been joining a number of our community satsangs, and it has been an absolute joy to get to know you, Sam, to feel your love for God, to feel your love for Dr. George, and to feel your continuous and burning desire for self-realization. Sam sent us, and we just brought these today to the new East LA Center, his book, Masters and Miracles. So we have this at the East LA Center when you come. And I just finished it over the weekend, and it's a beautiful tribute to his spiritual journey, meeting Dr. George, also experiences with Swami Rama and Sai Baba. But we wanted to have an informal satsang this evening so that Sam could share from his heart to ours. And I wanted to kick it off, Sam, by asking you the question of, how did you get started on the spiritual path? How did you meet Dr. George, Master George? How did it all begin for you?
Thing that happened to me was when I was 8 and my sister Gail was 10. My sister was totally deaf from birth. She had a nerve injury at birth, and then later it was discovered at the Mayo Clinic when she was 10 that she was going blind. She had tunnel vision, retinitis pigmentosus. And what puzzled me was I considered her to be a superior person to me in every way, so it didn't make any sense to me that she was afflicted in this way. I was raised Presbyterian. I used to ask Presbyterian preachers why, and they would say, well, it's God's will. And I said, I was a math major, so I have this strange logic that comes in periodically. So I said, so you mean God is a lottery? Oh, they got all upset about that. But my mother was hoping for faith healing for Gail, and she went to a faith healer. And this faith healer, strangely enough, had gone to Bob Raymer's Minneapolis SRF Center. And he gave my mother a copy of the Autobiography of Yogi, so I got the autobiography when I was 16 in 1960. And I read it from cover to cover the first time I had it in my hands. And it's been my Bible ever since. And I thank Ananda very much for doing the real autobiography of Yogi. Thank you. And so anyway, I started meditating on my own, and I got nowhere. It was like beating my head up against a wall. And so I logically thought to myself, well, what I need to go to India to get a real yogi master like Yogananda. I needed to find a real yogi master. So I told all my buddies who thought I was absolutely daft. But I arranged for a scholarship to spend my junior year at the University of Benares. And I was all set to go. I had my passport, I had my shots, I had everything. And I went to see this aforementioned faith healer and to thank him for his help for my sister and so forth. And he said, "Why are you going to India?" I said, "I'm going there to find a real yogi master." And he said, "There's a real yogi master in Milwaukee, Wisconsin." I said, "Surely you're kidding me." He said, "No, his name is Dr. George." Well, I had no address, no phone number, no nothing. And I asked Ed, "Well, how do you know he's real?" And he said, "Because I took the train to see him and he miraculously healed my wife at a distance." And so I got in my car and I left at 8 p.m. and I drove all night long and I got into Milwaukee at about 6 a.m. And it took me darn near 12 hours of detective work. And I finally found this guy they called Dr. George. And I knew when I found my teacher that I would know. And I took one look at him and I knew. And that night when I meditated with him, oh my goodness, I had my first, mystical experience. Oh boy, the energy went up my spine at all. I thought, hey, this is the real thing. So the next morning I said to him, I said, "Dr. George, would you be my teacher?" And he said, "No, you need to go to India to find a real yogi master." And I said, "No, I don't need to go to India. I know who you are. You can't fool me." And then he proceeded to point out all my flaws and my weaknesses and karma. And so I kept arguing with him. And finally, his eyes gleamed. His eyes used to gleam like this whenever he mentioned master. And he smiled and he said, "Okay, I'll help you. Master told me you were coming. He sent you to me." So I drove immediately back to Minnesota. I packed up everything I had and I moved to Milwaukee. And I bless the day that I met Dr. George. He was a true saint, a true master.
Sam, how old were you when this happened?
20.
Wow. And when you moved there, what was it like to be under his, spiritual guidance?
Well, here's the thing. Okay, now I wish one of these, I'm going to Milwaukee and I'm going to be getting pictures, and the next edition of my book is going to have pictures. Okay, Dr. George, starting in the 1920s and through the 1930s, built this huge monstrosity of a homemade building that during the Depression housed as many as 18 or 19 families. And he built it all out of used lumber, used this, used that. He used linoleum for the roof. Okay, there was nothing that was square. Rooms tilted. You wandered around in there. It was amazing. And Bob Raymer told a story about how Master sent him to see George. And when he first came into this monstrosity of a building, Bob Raymer, who was a wealthy kid from St. Paul, Minnesota, thought, well, maybe Master sent me to help this man, nice man. And Dr. George told him to go lie down on the couch in this particular room. And he lay down on the couch and the dust raised all up. And the next thing you knew, Bob had an incredible mystical experience. The Shakti went up his spine and his crown chakra opened up. And Bob always said, he doesn't need my help. So the same thing kind of happened with many people, myself among them. So what we did with that, we just worked normal jobs. And Dr. George told us, he said, you must learn to be in the world, but not of the world. You'll be able to be in any circumstance, any outer circumstance, but still have love, divine consciousness, and joy. And that was our he put all of us in very strange circumstances. And now every Tuesday, we would gather at that big old building, and we gradually took it down board by board, and we transported it to 160 acres up in central Wisconsin. I mean, 160 miles away, 80 acres in central Wisconsin, where we built an ashram out of all used lumber, used everything. And I don't know how to describe it. Dr. George was very kind of Zen, and as well as being a yogi from Yogananda. There was nobody like Dr. George. So many people came and they saw all this stuff going on, and they ran. I mean, but people who wanted, what I wanted was, I wanted to be able to enjoy everywhere, anytime, and that's the people who wanted that consciousness stayed. And we were a strange bunch of people. Well, I mean, we were very strong, stubborn, ornery, and it was, I'll just tell you one story about Jerry Neal. Jerry was Dr. George's assistant. And Jerry was a big moose of a guy. He had been in the Navy. So he's probably the only holy man in the history of America who, when he had a short sleeve shirt on, had big anchor tattoos on his big biceps. And Jerry was living in Chicago with a wife and 3 kids, little kids, and he finished reading the Autobiography of a Yogi. The next day, in the mail, came a handwritten postcard saying, "Jerry, I need your help. Come and see me, Dr. George, SRF." At that time, Dr. George was the SRF center for Milwaukee and Chicago. If you go back in the old East-West magazines and the old SRF magazines from the 40s and the 50s, there's Dr. George right in there. And he had the center. Well, Jerry showed up, and Dr. George told him, "Jerry, I need your help. We got to work, get to work here." So after a couple of years with Dr. George, Jerry was told by Dr. George, "Okay, I want you to take the service on Sunday." So Dr. George said, "You play this record, and we meditate, then you do this, play this record, and blah, 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 and then you finish up with a meditation and you play this record." So after the service, Dr. George came and said, "Jerry, you handled it very well, but maybe next time you plug in the record player." Now, in this great monstrosity of a building, it had been condemned by the city in 1934. Now, you guys understand how much power people in the city have when it comes to buildings. Building inspector, I mean, they have almost unlimited power. Well, they tried condemning Dr. George's place in 1934, and I joined them in 1964, and I saw a Milwaukee City cop come up and tap a condemn notice. So I asked Dr. George, I said, "How can you still be here?" And his eyes gleamed, and he said very humbly, he said, "Master wants me to live here." And I thought to myself, if you have Dr. George and Master on one side of an equation, you can pretty well kiss goodbye the other side. And so this criminal bunch of bandits with submachine guns came in with 4 or 5 cars and about 20 people, and they moved in on Dr. George. And Jerry and Dr. George and Gordy and a couple other guys told me about this story. And they said, "Listen, we know that you're harmless, you're a preacher, and as long as you don't mess with us, we won't shoot you, and we'll stay here." So Yogananda had told Dr. George the last time he saw him, he said, "George," he said, "I'm going to be on the other side. I'm going to be very busy." He said, "I don't want you to bother me too much." He said, "You can handle things." He said, "Don't bother me too much." Well, that night, Dr. George went into deep meditation and contacted Master on the other side. And Master said, George, I told you I'm busy, but okay, I'll handle this. He said, they'll be gone by tomorrow. So what happened was, honest to God, in the middle of the night, cockroaches, thousands of them, just thousands and thousands of cockroaches just descended on these people, and they ran out of the place, leaving half their stuff, and they just never to come back. Now, Jerry Neal, if his wife is still in the body, and she can confirm this, this is one of our favorite stories. Jerry and Gordy and another fellow came and said, and Dr. George, all the cockroaches died. So Jerry and Gordy and this other guy came, and they worked half the day scooping up all these cockroaches, and they used them as firewood. It was kind of cold at that part, and so so Gordy had a buddy at Marquette University, and he put a couple of these cockroaches in his pocket, and he took them to Marquette University to his buddy, and he said, see what you could find out about it. And the guy from the biology department said, quote, these are rare Asian cockroaches never found in the United States.
Unbelievable.
Oh, it's so, George was so, I mean, God bless his heart, and he was so humble, and the miracles he did were so selfless and so hidden. He was like, pretty wild. It's just, so it was not easy because we were all going through all these hard circumstances of one kind or another. And I worked inwardly over and over and over to make a connection so I could stay in that joy all the time. And 4.5 years went by. And I happened to be working on the side of a building, and the scaffold broke, and I fell 12 feet and landed on my head on concrete. And I was essentially dead. If you saw my medical record, it's like this thick. And life signs gone, life signs regained, and so forth. Well, Fred and Bill drove Dr. George to the Marshfield Hospital, following the cop car, who was going over 120 miles an hour. And George came in, and he told the surgeon to patch me up as best he could, and he would do the rest. And he sat there and meditated. My mom and dad came down from Minnesota, and the doctors told them that I would be dead or a vegetable. But Dr. George said, no, he's going to be fine. And then he said to the head surgeon, can you imagine somebody doing this today? But he told the head surgeon, he said, have Sam's mother stay in the room with him. So my mom stayed in the room with me, and I was in a coma for 35 days. And when I was working on the side of that building, I was listening to the Chicago Cubs play the St. Louis Cardinals on the radio. And when I woke up in that hospital bed, my mom and dad were sitting there watching a baseball game, and Bob Gibson was pitching for St. Louis, and they said the next batter for the Detroit Tigers will be Norm Cash. And I thought to myself, now why? First of all, I thought, what in the heck am I doing here? Because, of course, I didn't remember any of this. And the second thing was I was curious as to why Detroit was playing St. Louis, because they were in different leagues. There was no interleague play in those days. But it was September 1st approximately when I fell. Now it was October, and it was the World Series. So I woke up just in time for the first inning of the 68 World Series, and I knew God wasn't going to let me miss the 68 World Series. That was a great World Series. And so the Detroit Tigers, I was rooting for them, and they beat St. Louis 4-3. So anyway, now came a struggle, because here I am, and everybody thought I am gone. And the doctors treated me like a lab specimen. I mean, they couldn't believe I was okay. So they were looking at me, and they're kind of slinking around and looking at me curiously, and I didn't know what the heck to do. So finally, this head doctor was a Muslim, Dr. Salibi. And I said to him, I said, you know, it was wonderful the way Mohammed fasted for 40 days and 40 nights and got a teaching for his people. And he looked at me and said, "You know the Quran?" I said, "Oh, yes." And he said, "Well, you seem to be okay." And I got out the next day. So that was the extent of my knowledge of the Quran. That's it. But at least that one line did work. So, and they gave me a whole big box of medicines, literally a good sized box, like 4 inches by 3 inches by a foot. And I took them to show them to Dr. George, and he said, quote, "They would make very good firewood." So I threw them in the fireplace, and that was the end of that. And thank you, Dr. George. He saved my life. Now, the other thing that happened was that when I woke up in that hospital, since then, I've had the joy of God that I was looking for in my soul. And even though I've gone through really, really hard times sometimes, I always can get back to that joy, and it's always with me 24/7. And I am grateful to Dr. George, and I'm just extremely grateful. And he, a master goes after your flaws. And the flaws, inner and flaws, are what keep us from the realization. If, like George used to say to all of us, like he said, you must forgive unconditionally. And as long as we can forgive unconditionally, the joy never leaves us. And Jesus said, before you go into the temple, make peace with your brother. So here's the temple. And Dr. George also says, unless you can forgive, you can't successfully meditate. So forgiveness is a real key to meditation and the joy of meditation. And what if you watch now, Dr. George, when we built all these buildings, that's what we did around him. We built buildings. Now, one thing that I did was we had a pine forest where they were overtaking oak trees. So we needed oak trees for building buildings and for firewood. So I was out in the woods cutting down oak trees. I like to be by myself and cutting down oak trees and dragging them out, and we used them for struts and for so forth. So Dr. George taught us to build a building. We would dig with a post hole digger down 4 feet past the frost line. Then we put a post there, and we put these posts around, and then we'd put used boards and board up the outside. Then we would go over to the sawmill, and we would get shavings, and we would wrap them in newspaper, and as we boarded up the inside, we'd put the shavings inside. So the buildings we built were cool in the summertime and very easy to heat in the wintertime. It's the best insulation there is. And so we built many buildings. And we probably could sleep 30, 35, 40 people there at the ashram. And it was, all homemade buildings that violated every building code known to mankind. And here's Dr. George specialized in building windows. To give you an idea, let's say that he had a piece of glass that was cracked at the top at a 45-degree angle, but the rest of the thing was square. Well, Dr. George would build a window frame to fit the glass and then put it in the building we were building. And even at his advanced age, he could outwork, almost all of us. And so what we did was we worked around Dr. George, and his vibration was so powerful. Many, many times I would sit on a couch, and he'd have the TV on, and that incredible bliss that he just emanated would just fill my whole being. And also I learned that have the TV on, but the minute my consciousness started to stir towards the TV instead of towards the bliss, he would go like this and move all around, and so I learned to focus no matter what was going on outside of me. And it was the strangest training. And then, you know, I could go on for days telling about all the miracles that, and just little ones that he did. One of my favorites is there was two brothers, Tommy Trend and Bobby Trend, and they were pretty good guys. And I helped Tommy play the guitar. I was teaching him how to play the guitar, and Bobby wanted to play the banjo, but he just was all thumbs. He could not play the banjo. I was going to try and teach him how to play the banjo. But anyway, Bobby and Tommy, they always told all of our favorite stories. They were making a roof, and they had finished up most of the roof, and they were on the edge of the roof, and it was getting about supper time. And Dr. George was standing here, and he said to them, "Well, boys," he said, "maybe we should go back in and get supper, get all cleaned up." And Bobby and Tommy, the way they told the story was so funny because they realized right at that moment that Dr. George was standing on air. He was like two to 3 feet at that particular point to the east of the roof. And so they were in shock, and he stepped back onto the roof, and he said, "We better not talk about this too much." And so he was always doing stuff like that. And it was really, and it was fun. It was just, with Dr. George, it was just joy, 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 joy. And the one thing I learned early on, and this was a really important lesson, and I learned it inwardly, was that if I was looking at the outer Dr. George for fulfillment, wham, you can't believe the problems that came my way. I mean, he would chew me out. He would do and whatnot. But the minute I learned to find the real guru, the inner guru, then everything was copacetic. And in 1976, I came off the road from playing music, and I came to the farm, and Dr. George had all these documents and seals and so forth, and he handed them to me, and he said, "You're now a minister." And he said, "I'm making you a minister, and you're authorized to teach the Kriya Yoga." And he said, "I will guide you, and I will send you the right people." Well, in 1978, I had gotten married, and I was living in Kansas City while my wife was getting her doctorate there. And I was meditating on a Friday night late, and George came to me, and he said very clearly, he said, "Come and see me." So on Monday, I flew to Milwaukee, and Dr. George was there, and I knew that his time had come. So I had told a few other guys, and so Haley came in from Michigan, and Bill came in from Connecticut, and another guy came in from Los Angeles, and we had a nice time with Dr. George for a few days, couple days, and then Dr. George said to us, he said, "Okay," he said, "you can go now." And then he told me, he said, "I want you to move back to Minnesota and start a center in Minnesota." Those were the last words he said to me. Then two days later, he passed away. And he was on his deathbed, and Debbie, one of our people in the church, Debbie was there, and she was crying. And Dr. George sat up, bolt upright, and he looked at her and he said, "Debbie," he said, "Christ is light." And then he lay back down and passed away. Those were his last words. Yeah. So I moved it back to Minnesota, and I had no idea what to do about starting a center. I mean, I thought, the thought of me, I know myself too well, so it's a great humor thinking of myself as a spiritual teacher. Okay, that first of all brings a lot of laughter to my consciousness. Okay, because I don't know, I don't consider myself that kind of spiritual teacher material, but Dr. George told me to start a center. So I play music. So I figured, what the heck? And so I just started the center, and one by one, people came, and we, for many, many, many years, we had a large center. And when I first started off, I was thinking, geez, I hope I'm doing the right thing. So I was praying and praying, to asking Master and asking Dr. George for guidance. And all of a sudden, one night, they came to me and they were laughing at me, both of them. I don't get that many visions, but they both came to me and they were standing there laughing at me. And they told me, they said, your job is to show up. And I thought, oh, okay. And then I caught all the unspoken, which means that they're in charge. And so it's all I got to do is show up. And basically, whoever benefits from it is meant to benefit from it. And it's not on me. It's on Master and Dr. George. So I had the most easy job of a spiritual, leading a spiritual group of anybody who ever led one. It was just fun. We played music, and I told a few stories, and we shared, basically satsang, and it was really, really fun. We had a great bunch of people for many, many years. Then came upon me that I had to go back to work, and that I had to go back to learn, and I had a lot of karma to work out. So I went through a long period, say from the late 90s up until just a few years ago, a real hard time of within myself to change certain things and to just work.
So I wanted to ask one question. There was what a miracle I read in your book about the inspector of the ramshackle place that Dr. George built and how he came back years later. I thought that was such an incredible miracle. Could you tell us that story?
This fellow had been the chief building inspector of the city of Milwaukee, and he had tried for years to get Dr. George out of that place. He said they had so many condemned notices, and he tried, legal action and this and that and everything else under the sun, and he failed. And partly because of his failure, he got fired from his job. And he slunk back home to this small town called Portage, Wisconsin, where he had grown up. In the meantime, his younger brother has started a very successful business, and this former building inspector went into business with his brother and became very, very wealthy. So he came back to see Dr. George, and he told him, he said, I know and I knew you were a holy man, and I told him that we should leave you alone. And he said, I know that it was because of your prayers from God that I got the wonderful thing that happened to me in my life, and I am so grateful to you. I mean, Dr. George, it wasn't like the guy Dr. George called up his brother and said, blah, blah, whatnot. But things happened that way with Dr. George. They really did. But it was so selfless. You couldn't connect it unless you really knew.
How many people do you think recognized his greatness?
I would say over the years, I would say no more than 50 or 60 total. Yogananda said very clearly, verbally and in letters, and I read the letters, Yogananda said firmly, even in his letter, he said, George, don't let them know who you are. So Dr. George was a secret master, and then later in life, he did take on us students for probably the last 20 years or so of his life. And he was, but can you imagine this big building with 18 or 19 families during the Depression living there? I mean, it's just amazing. And we took the whole thing down board by board by board and transferred it with trucks and trailers. Oh, one more thing. Dr. George, I can tell you this on God, many times I would be riding in a truck, pulling a loaded trailer and a loaded truck, and Dr. George would be driving, and his eyes were closed. He drove for mile after mile after mile with his eyes closed. if I sure connected to the higher consciousness while that was going on. And we had many people, we had many people who witnessed that, and it was just we shook our heads. Many times we'd wonder why, and we would discuss things with each other as to what this was all about. I'm gonna tell you a real funny one. This is hilarious. Dr. George looked at me very solemnly, like when I was like 22, 23 years old. And I'd been with him for a couple of years. And he said, Sam, he said, my greatest temptation this lifetime was baseball. I said, wow. And I thought to myself for years, my Lord, I thought my guru, loves baseball, because I love baseball. I love baseball. And so what was funny was over the years, I would talk to other people in the church. And I remember I talked to Jerry one time and I said, Jerry, isn't it something that Dr. George's big temptation was baseball? And Jerry looked at me. He said, what? Who said that? So years go by. Dr. George passes from the earth. It's about 7 years later. I remember it's clear as a bell, 1985. And I was meditating. And it's like this energy went up my spine. And that song, Darkness Like a Dark Bird, flies away, flies away. And all of a sudden, I realized that temptation and that desire wasn't Dr. George's. It was mine. and that's how he kind of worked with us. And so even though I love baseball, I don't have any dreams or any attachments or anything like I once did. And so one of the questions you were asking was politics. Again, Dr. George used to say to me over and over, Yogananda said, don't get involved in politics. And well, I don't know, it's very tough. I am interested. But again, I could feel the moment when that desire left my soul. I no longer had that desire. Dr. George said one time, he said, the dark forces control politics and they control money. And he said, they do a good job of it. There was a fellow from LA who was a Sai Baba devotee in LA, Haley Haynes, and many devotees from LA of both SRF and of Sai Baba and other things, once they found out about Dr. George, quite a few of them made pilgrimages to Milwaukee regularly. And Haley woke up one day in LA and he was thinking to himself, I think I'm going to run for city council. I can do really good. I got to do some good in this world. And so a couple of days later, he flew to Milwaukee to see Dr. George. And he got off the airplane and Dr. George met him. And Dr. George said, yeah, Haley, he said, Master said, stay out of politics. and so that ended Haley's political career right then. Another time, George came to LA and I picked him up at the airport. And Fred and another person were there in the car and I was driving. And Fred said to Dr. George, he said, should we stop and get something to eat? And I thought the thought, oh my God, I wonder where my credit card and my traveler's checks and stuff are. And as I thought that thought, Dr. George patted my knee and said, that's okay, Sammy. He says, I'll pay. I mean, all the time.
You reminded me, Sam, of how our Swami Kriyananda told those stories of Master Yogananda and how he said, I know every thought you think. Can you share some of those experience, like that story you just shared? Were there other times where you felt such an attunement with Dr. George that it was beyond the rational mind?
Oh, yes. I'll try to think of one. Okay. I was in, used to do a program for school assembly programs called History of American Folk Music. And I had a Chevy wagon and it had about 90-some thousand miles on it back in the 70s. And I was in Lubbock, Texas, and the engine was missing. And so I went to the car dealer, and this guy smoked a cigar and blew cigar smoke in my face and put a high pressure whammy on me to buy a new Chevy wagon there. And I said, forget it. And that was Wednesday. Well, nothing happened by Thursday or Friday. And there was a young salesman there. And he said, I wouldn't buy a car here if I was you. He said, this guy's not a good guy. The salesman said that. He said, I'm quitting soon and moving to Austin, Texas. Well, on Friday, I did a program at a grade school, and the principal and his wife invited me over to their house for supper, and they invited me to their church. It was a charismatic Christian church, and they were going to play bluegrass gospel that night. And boy, I love that. So I went to dinner, and I went to that bluegrass gospel concert, and I got high as a kite. And the next morning, I woke up, and I was just absolutely high as a kite. And I was in the shower, and this voice said, take the deal. And I looked out, I thought somebody had come into the room. And then I thought, the car. So I drove back over and I made a deal and bought a new Chevy wagon with that young salesman. And he gave me a real good deal. And I called my dad, and my dad said he couldn't do any better up in Minnesota. So I gave him a check, and they were going to clear it by noon on Monday. So when I came to pick up my new car, the young salesman took me out to lunch, and he told me that car that you traded in had a cracked block. And the owner didn't know it yet. That mean, evil owner didn't know it yet. So Dr. George was always around. This fellow, John, and I were working on the side of a building, and we were getting up pretty high where we couldn't reach. And we were thinking, both of us were looking for something to stand on. And around the corner, from the garage way over here, where he had been working on a power saw, here came Dr. George with a bench for us to stand on.
Your life must, I just can't believe how blessed you were, Sam, to have known Dr. George, to hear these stories. I wanted to see if anyone else we could just open it up, if you're okay, Sam, and see if other questions about Dr. George.
But I want to say one thing. Okay, everything, the outer was a lot of fun, but it didn't mean anything compared to the inner. It was all about the inner. And so, to me, when I see or something or whatever, I have to pick up on the inner. And I've heard many, many, many people, holy men, saints, and sages, and whatnot, speak, but there's some real ones. Like your Swami was real. He was absolutely real. Oliver Black was real. Swami Vishwananda is real. Swami Rama. I remember Sai Baba. The first time I flew to India to see Sai Baba, everybody said, well, you got to ask him for something. I said, I don't need anything. And so they said, well, quietly in your own mind, ask him for something. So on the airplane, I said to Sai Baba, okay, Baba, I want to have the best meditation I ever had my whole life. And on the second day there, I sat on my cushion outside the Mandir temple with my back up against the wall. And to this day, people witnessed it. I never moved for 5 hours. And I absolutely was high on God as a kite. And I said, thank you, Sai Baba. And I never found a better place to practice the Kriya than sitting early 3:45 a.m. to 6 a.m. in the morning, waiting there at Sai Baba's place with all the thousands and thousands of people. And it was the greatest place to practice the Kriya. I actually felt like a real yogi. And when you're around Dr. George and you meditated, it was the bliss. Oh, gee, I was just so grateful. And, to this day, every minute I can tune in, and he's right there with me all the time. He's just with me all the time. And I have to tell you, okay, I've had many problems in this lifetime, and they all stem from the following. Dr. George told me, he said that I was a soldier and a warrior for many, many lifetimes. And he said, you have a lot of karma to work out from those lifetimes. He said, you did harm. And I remembered one time I had a vision where I was Oriental and I had a gang of like hundreds of guys, and we ransacked, raided villages, so forth and so on. And Dr. George told me, he said, every once in a while you would be a woman and you would give life. But he said, you came up the Kashastri path, and he said, no more. He said, now, you come unarmed, and you must do it with love. And you must learn how to forgive. And you must not fight. There's no wars for you to fight anymore. And so many, many situations and problems and crazy things happened to me, but I remained happy because I realized that, and this is, I got to share this important thing with you people. This is a real truth. We people on the spiritual path, as we're working, as we're doing our kriyas, as we're doing our mantras, as we're trying to do service and help people, whatever, we're doing the best we can, all of us, working on the spiritual path. Remember, Dr. George said, you do 25%, the guru does 25%, and God does 50%. So us having a guru like Yogananda, and I want to tell you something. I got Swami Kriyananda is working his tail off on the other side right now. Okay, he's with you. He's helping. He's uplifting, working with you guys. He really loves you guys. And so same with Dr. George. What has happened to me in my lifetime could have been 10 times, 100 times worse because of but I pretty well come to the end of it. Well, I'm 76. It's about time I got to the end of
it. Sam, we are so grateful for the joy that you bring, the delightful sense of humor. We have about a half hour left for our satsang. We have a beautiful group tonight of about 25 souls here. Does anyone have a question for Sam?
I do. I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, I can.
So my question is, what's your experience of Dr. George and his presence now?
He is so close, it's unbelievable. And I want to tell you something. If you get a picture of him, just look at his picture for, say, 15, 20 minutes and chant his name and ask for help, ask for guidance or something on a particular issue. He is, this is the wonderful thing. He is just as much with you as he is with me. Like, for example, like Swami Kriyananda is just as much with me as he is with you guys. So nobody has a position. He is just right there. And he's very practical, very practical. George was practical. That's a technique that Dr. George taught us, which is if you look at a picture of a saint or a master, like Yuktesvar is a fantastic one.
Who?
Yuktesvar. Look, if you have a problem, if you have an issue, look for 20 minutes with almost unblinking and chant the name of the saint and ask for help on that problem and focus. And you will get an answer. Try it. It's a good technique.
I will. Thank you.
Yeah.
There's Sam's book, Masters of Miracles. There's a beautiful photo of Dr. George on here. I'm just trying to bring it up close. And you can feel, like Sam was saying, the bliss that he emanates. In fact, Dharma Devi and I saw the YouTube with Sam about a year ago. Someone had forwarded it to us. This was a YouTube video with Sam and others from the ashram there in Milwaukee that Sam had been talking about tonight, just sharing stories like Sam did tonight about Dr. George. And Dharma Devi and I were just struck. We remembered Sam, but we didn't know him, and now here we are. And
Here's a picture of nice picture of Dr. George that I have.
show us.
Let me see. It's too big to. Oh, there it goes. Can you see him?
Yeah, that's great.
I'll send you guys a picture. Here's a picture of my sister, Gail. Can you see? This is a picture of my sister, Gail.
Yeah, we can see her.
She got the look of the family. Gail, well, here's an interesting one. Gail, I worked the midnight to 8 shift running a computer, and I went to school, college full-time during the day. And one night, February 2nd, 1967, my boss told me to shut down the computer and that some people were coming to see me. And 2 Milwaukee cops came and they picked me up and they were absolutely silent and grim. And they drove me home and my house had burned down and my sister passed away in the fire. And so Dr. George lived right next door. And for 2.5 years, George never said a word to me about it. And he knew that I wanted to get it inwardly. And I told Divine Mother, I said, look, I'm going to be meditating every morning and every night. And I want to know why. I want to know why. So I said, Yogananda said that you could experience truth in the atoms of your being. So I want to know. I don't want to hear a platitude. I don't want to hear a book. I want to know. So I was cutting down dead oak trees at the farm, and I stopped to rest with my back up against a tree and got a bottle of water. And a deer ran right by me, maybe no more than 10, 15 feet away. And all of a sudden, the Shakti went up my spine, and I had probably I talked to a Cheyenne medicine man, and he told me that I had a medicine vision. And so I was right up here in the highest state of consciousness, and I saw that my sister had chosen to come to Earth in this form, deaf and going blind. I saw that she had a long history with both Dr. George and Yogananda and Jesus. And I saw that she worked out the final bit of her karma, and she was in the highest possible state, that this was her last lifetime. And she worked out, and Yogananda and Jesus had sent her to be with Dr. George so that he could help her out of this. Then I saw that in one of her most recent lifetimes, she was actually a queen, royalty, a real queen. And everybody had said all about her that she had a regal, stance, and she had that kind of queenly, aura. Well, right after I had that vision, then all of a sudden, for the next week, Dr. George outwardly was filling me in on the vision, that I had. He wanted me to get it inwardly before he would talk to me outwardly about it. So then but it took 2.5 years. And then years went by, and it was the late 80s. And my life partner, Janie, is a really, really good clairvoyant. We were meditating together, and she said, Dr. George is here, and he wants to tell you that he did not complete telling you in the body, that he wanted to say that your sister was Marie of Denmark, and she was the wife of the Tsar. And he said you could go to the St. Paul Public Library and see her picture. So I went down to the St. Paul Public Library, and I found out all about Marie of Denmark, married to Tsar Alexander II. 1881, he was assassinated. And but anyway, I saw, read about what actual past lifetime. And very rarely did Dr. George talk about past. And like I would ask him, and he would say, "Don't you have enough troubles this lifetime?" And so, but he would give me glimmers. And then also I got inwardly, he would show me inwardly some past lives. And that's how I found out about it.
Thank you for sharing that, Sam. These stories are deeply touching to our hearts. I think.
And in fact, I'll tell you something. When I love to say grace, because whenever I say grace, my mom, my dad, my sister, and Dr. George are right there with me. And so actually saying grace is a lot of fun for me. And it's I don't know why, but it always happens. So maybe it helps my digestion. I hope so.
Sam, the stories that you tell about Dr. George make him seem very practical and down to earth and even brusque sometimes. But when I look at his picture, he just looks so sweet.
Oh,
So sweet. Could you share some about that side of him? Dr.
Dr. George was so respectful of everybody. And one time we all went out to eat at this restaurant. There was about 6 or 7 of us and Dr. George. And there was a waitress that came over, and you could see how down she was. She had this sad, sad look in her eye. Her energy was just like rock bottom, and she was hurting so bad, and she was trying to wait on us, but I could see, or I could see. And she came to Dr. George, and there was almost like a flicker of light that came out of his eyes. And Zam, the next thing you knew, that lady was just all zippy, happy, cheery, and whatnot. And he did that. And he was always so kind to everybody. And now, for those of us who had asked for his help, being just like Yuktesvar was very hard on Yogananda. Yogananda was hard on people, but that was for their own benefit. And one time Dr. George was chewing me out. And as he was chewing me out in front of all kinds of people, the Shakti, just beautiful energy, went up my spine and melted my spine and up and to my neck. And I'll never forget, it was a beautiful experience. And I was looking at Dr. George, and he was almost laughing as he was chewing me out. And so he never, I don't know how to, he wasn't gruff at all. I mean, I hate to say, but he did put us to work, okay? I mean, I remember one time it was winter. Oh my Lord, it was so cold. And George and I and a young boy were putting in flooring, and it was ice cold. We got back to the house for lunch, and I was sitting there, and I didn't want to move. And Dr. George kind of put me on the shoulder, and he said, "Come on, Sammy, we got to go." And so off into that cold winter ice we went and finished that floor. And so Lord knows why all these, what we did. Lord knows why we did those things. And it was a mystery. He was a mystery too. He was just very mysterious. I didn't find out until like 10 or 11 years after I'd been with him that he went into the breathless state. I didn't know that, but he did. And one spring, one of the girls there told us all about it. And so I asked Dr. George, I said, I love this idea of the breathless state. When can I go into the breathless state? And he laughed and laughed, and he said, just keep working. Just keep working.
Thank you for sharing that, Sam.
But I'm glad Ramurti that you brought that up, and because he was well, okay, Ramurti, I will tell you this story. Dr. George was an orphan, and when he was 5, he was on a farm outside of West Bend, Wisconsin, and he's probably the only person I ever knew in my life who worked his way through grade school. He worked on this farm and was a mean farmer, and he only fed him oatmeal, plus the milk from the milk that he milked the cows. Well, after some years, a kindly older childless family took him in and was really good to Dr. George. And this the mean farmer's house got hit by lightning, and the whole farm got leveled and burned down. So I told that story one time, and all of a sudden I realized something was wrong. So I meditated and prayed, and I said, how am I telling the story wrong? And George came and said, quote, the reason he told it wrong was, I love that man. I didn't burn down his house. His karma and his thoughts did. He says, I love him. I'm trying to help him to this day. And so that's the real Dr. George.
It's beautiful.
Thank you, Sam. That's wonderful.
My mother loved Dr. George, and she would come from Grand Rapids, Minnesota, up in the North Country, not that far from the Canadian border, and drive down all the way to central Wisconsin to be with us at the farm one weekend per month. And Dr. George really liked her. And then after my sister passed away, I had that vision, and I was pretty happy, but my dad, God bless his heart, hit the booze and was pretty tough shape most of the rest of, well, he was very sad. And my mother, in maybe 7 years after Gail passed away, my mother got paralyzed. And she had an inflammation on the spinal cord, and we had the top neurologist in the world working with her at the University of Minnesota. But he told me one time, he said, I wish I could help your mom, but he said, we don't know what's wrong. So for the last 27 years of her life, she was paralyzed. And she got around sometimes with a walker and a wheelchair, but she had a lot of pain. And I talked to Dr. George, and I said to him, I said, Dr. George, I said, I've seen you. You've healed so many people. I said, why don't you heal my mom? And Dr. George said, very, very, almost like wistfully and very sadly, he said, Divine Mother has not given me permission. Then, as time went on, after all those years that my mom had driven down from Grand Rapids down to the farm, for many years, Dr. George took a crew of people and drove all the way from Wisconsin once a month up to Grand Rapids, all the way up to Grand Rapids, Minnesota, and to see my mother. He was just amazing. We'd be up at the farm Friday, Saturday, and Sunday working. We'd work on Sunday, then we'd have a meditation, then we'd have lunch, and then we'd all go out to go home. In the wintertime in Wisconsin, Dr. George had one of his greatest leelas. None of the cars would start. I mean, I remember one time I had a brand new car, it wouldn't start. And so we were fiddling around. And we would try this, and we get heaters, and we get this. So we had extension cords running here and there, and we would have this big drama. And finally, I finally learned after a while. I watched Dr. George carefully. It was like finally he just sort of said, "Okay, enough of that," and bang, all the cars would start. And so, why you say why would that happen? Well, who knows? I mean, just who knows? And he told me a lot of my flaws. So in a lot of karma and whatnot, he told me one time. He said, I asked him. I said, when was I with you in a body? And he said 325 BC. And I said, where? And he said, India. I said, was I Hindu? He said, no, you were Greek. And Alexander's army reached the Ganges River. And that's as far as they got, because this big army led by some Rajas had huge elephants, and they came charging down on Alexander's army, and nobody retreated so fast as Alexander. And I was captured, and I was held there by this guy. And in those days, they held like I was sort of like a general or a commander, and I was being held for ransom, but nothing ever came. But in the meantime, I wound up living there. I settled down, had a family, and that's when I met Dr. George, and he was a holy man in India, and I met him and at that time, and so I was in the body with him. And he told me about that. And then he laughed and laughed, and he said to me, he said his quote was, "Yeah," he said, "you were really high and mighty, but he said you got your face full," meaning those Hindus, with their elephants, they just really kicked our butt, the Greeks. This was the next to the last time I saw him on Earth, and we were up at the farm, and we had a big group there, and Dr. George, after the meditation, said, "Would you people like to hear about one of Sam's previous lifetimes?" And everybody laughed and laughed because they knew that I had been asking about lifetimes and all. I was always curious. So he said that I was riding across what's now the American desert, and I had a few horses, a pack horse, and I was a mountain man prospector. And I stopped at a oasis, and I watered the animals, and I took the saddles off and so forth, and I was lying there taking a snooze by the water, and he said a big fat rattlesnake crawled right over my stomach and headed for the water. And he said, now, then he asked the people, he said, what was Sam's first reaction? And then he laughed. He said, Sam's first reaction was, who can I tell this story to that'll believe me? And then he said, interestingly enough, you got killed fairly quickly thereafter, and you never had a chance to tell that story. So I'm telling the story because you still have that desire in you to tell a story, and we need to get rid of these desires.
Incredible. Thank you for sharing that one, Sam. Absolutely delightful. Did anyone have a question for Sam? We have about 10 minutes left for the satsang. You said a lot that Dr. George talked about forgiveness, and I'm wondering, it's such a polarizing, intense, and fear-filled time with a lot of anger and, just negative energy in the world. How did you learn to practice forgiveness in your life through the grace of God and Dr. George? Could you share a little bit more with us on
practice. You got to consciously practice. And when I first moved to Milwaukee, I worked sewer and water construction for a year and a half. And I was at the bottom of the barrel, and there was this foreman who used the first stream of profanity to come out of his mouth, and basically I said, okay, this is a laboratory. So I started sending him love. And he was the roughest, toughest hombre who ever came along. And I just kept sending him love. And every time he'd do something mean, I'd forgive him and send him love. And after about 6 months, all of a sudden, he sort of selected me to go on all these easy jobs. Like, let's say we had to drive, go get another pickup truck or go get this or whatever. And so I used to ride with him. And then he started telling me all about his wife and his kids and about how much he missed his kids, and his wife had left him and moved to California and blah, blah, and whatnot. And so I kind of became almost like a father confessor to this guy. And I was like 20 years old and he was like 40 and was, he was 6'5" and was his foreman. But you have to practice. And so I tried. Now, but there is one thing. And this is Dr. George also said. He said, you should not be a victim. Okay, being nonviolent does not mean being a victim. Forgiveness is inwardly. Sometimes outwardly, you may have to hiss, and you have to stand your ground outwardly, even though you forgive inwardly. And like Lord Krishna said to Arjuna, you must fight the war, but you must be detached. We all know the story about Krishna and Arjuna. So that is very, the story of Krishna and Arjuna is very applicable to our daily life almost all the time, no matter what we do or where we are. And because sometimes we have to fight. I mean, we have to fight outwardly in the circumstances we have today. And I think we must be strong, and we must hold on to the kingdom of heaven within us, and hold on to the Spirit, and hold on to the close spiritual friends we have. So it's a strangest time, but I think we're heading for eventually, maybe 50, 60 years. I think we're heading for like the golden age. Dwapara Yuga is really going to kick in, and things are going to really change. But I think we are the spiritual revolutionaries. We're like the shock troops that have been sent. But fortunately, I think right now on this earth, and all the places I've been, traveled all over this place, I see nothing but good people everywhere. Human relationships, that's our teacher. That's what teaches us, and that's what makes us grow bigger and bigger and bigger.
Sam, we want to thank you so very much for this beautiful satsang and the beautiful energy you shared with us tonight, the remembrance of Dr. George, of his greatness, his attunement to God and to Yogananda ji, and just keeping his spirit alive. We feel his spirit and his joy and Master's joy through you, and we're grateful.
And vice versa. And you should please give my email address and my phone number out to everybody in case they want to connect with me. I'm happy. Hey, I'm 76 years old. I'm not doing anything. I'm happy to talk to anybody.
We will, Sam.
It is. This is a great joy. And I cannot tell you how much I appreciate you guys, Ram Murtry and you, Narayan, and Paul, and all you guys, and nice ladies, and God bless all of you. I love each and every one of you. And I can't wait. One of these days, I'm going to be stumbling into LA, and I'll see you in person. I better tell one good joke before I leave. Are you guys up for one good joke?
Go for it.
Sure.
Okay. This minister, priest, and television preacher were discussing how they handled their collection money. And the minister said, I throw the money up in the air, and I have this small circle drawn around, and what falls inside the circle belongs to me. What falls outside belongs to God. And the priest said, oh, yeah, except I draw a large circle, and what falls inside that large circle belongs to God, and what falls outside belongs to me. And the television preacher said, oh, ye of little faith. They say, why? How do you handle it? He said, brothers, I believe and I have faith that when I throw that money up in the air, the Lord will keep up there what he needs.
Thank you, Sam.
God bless.
God bless.
Thank you, Sam, so much.
Good night, everyone.